Okay, participants are joining. Good.
Oh, that is good.
Um, welcome to those of you who've just arrived. We're going to give people a couple minutes to join before we get started. And yeah, seems like a nice, good sized group joining so far. Yeah, so just
I
give
don't
us a
know.
couple minutes and we'll get started. Welcome to those who just arrived.
Cool. How many do we normally get on something like this?
It varies so widely. I've had like webinars that were like 5 people showed up to, and we've had stuff that's like was almost 1,000. So
Wow.
something like this, if we break 100, I'll be very happy. And it's actually looking like it's heading that way, so that's
Oh,
really
that's
good.
good.
But I always think like anything, like 50 always feels like, oh, this was really worth doing. Like that always feels like a number where I'm like, yeah, like there was a good bunch of people that got something out of this. But even less, if it was great for that audience, I'm happy with it.
It's
So
weird because when you're doing things for real in front of people, you actually engage, you can see their faces and you know what's what. That's the thing, isn't it? So you can kind of feel the atmosphere. And if there's like three people that are interested, that's fantastic. Do you know what I mean? I don't really mind.
yeah, like you see the
It's
energy
yeah,
come in.
it's whether or not people want to be there. That's the thing.
Yeah.
More
Well,
than
here
anything.
it's like they can, if the number goes down, you get a sense of what the reaction is. But
You know, you dropped
that
a
doesn't
dad
happen.
joke. It was like, no, that's not going to work.
Yeah. Oh, the number just went down. Yeah.
Yeah. Uh,
Um, cool. So yeah, I'll just everybody. Thanks for everybody for coming. I'm just going to give it another minute just to give people a chance to show up, and then we'll get started. So is it it's snowing over there where you are, Stuart?
it is, but not where I am. I'm sort of near Guildford Way, so it's kind of like I'm seeing pictures from near other places in England where it's like glorious and people are sledging, but it's not like that here. But it might be tonight. It might snow heavily tonight. My kids are
Yeah.
like fingers crossed because they really want to go out and sledge, but that's not going to happen today, I don't
Yeah.
think. But it's really cold. It's like it looks nice, but it's chilly. But it's taken me
I
all
just
day to
got
get
a
this workshop in
confirmation
here.
that people are successfully able to connect to this after. I don't know if any of you guys came on last Monday when this was supposed to happen, and it was just like a crazy random Zoom outage. There was nothing we could have done. So for those of you who came and then came again, thank you very much for returning and. Thankfully, everything's working normally today. So I'm just going to get started. Very, very pleased to have Stuart Bray here today. Stuart will introduce himself. He's a very accomplished prosthetics artist, and I'm really fond of doing presentations on things in addition to sort of all the digital stuff we do to talk about practical things that you can touch and feel with your hands that are still part of the filmmaking process, but also connect to the digital work we do and sometimes work hand in hand with the digital tools. And so I always think that's a really interesting thing for this audience who are so, I mean, everything we do is on a screen, at Framestore pretty much. So it's so nice to see someone who touches things with their hands and can talk about that. It's exciting. So tangible things. So yeah, that's sort of the thinking behind this, why this would be interesting to this audience. And Stuart, take it away.
Oh my, it's me talking now. uh, well, hello, my name is Stuart Bray, and I basically make bits of rubber and stick it on people's faces. One thing I should make clear is that I don't run like a company. I'm self-employed, but I normally worked as a freelancer for everybody. So I worked for other people as a pair of hands. So where I speak from is from the maker point of view. So I don't really know that much about overarching budgets for massive movies and managing huge teams. That's not my thing. I'm somebody that is saying, right, we need this by the end of next week, make it now, figure out how to make it work. So that's what I'm going to kind of focus on. And it's a lot of processes, it's a lot of stages of from one thing to the next, and each process then has a bearing on the outcome of the next stage and all that kind of stuff. So that's kind of what the first bit of this is going to be. I've got some pictures I'm going to show, and and then we can talk at the end if you have like questions about things you want to know more about. But basically, the idea of this is to sort of reveal the steps and the processes, how I would approach certain things, and then to sort of show you how they work together. And the other thing I want to talk a little bit about is how the digital stuff has affected certain things and where it kind of creeps in and what it is that digital has been doing with practical and where it's been useful and where there are certain things that I wish I knew more about that I could incorporate. Andrew and I were talking a little earlier about like scanning, for example, like if you can scan heads, like scanners are now sort of affordable, really. You can get a decent scanner for not nearly as much as it used to be. and that's great, but there isn't as many people who could do that, would then know what to do with the data efficiently, because that's not their background, that's not what they know. So there's a kind of a deficit there that would be an interesting thing to kind of bridge over time. But anyway,
Do
I
it real
think what I'll
quick. I just wanted to, I failed to mention at the beginning, yeah, about questions. I encourage you guys to put questions in the little Q&A box at the bottom. Just click on Q&A, add them at any time, just as you think of them. And if they're kind of relevant to what Stuart's saying in the moment, I'll kind of chime in and kind of bring it up then. Otherwise, we'll do questions at the end of the presentation. But please enter the questions as we go, so we have a few of them ready for when Stuart finishes.
excellent, cool. All right. Well, what I'm going to do is I'm going to go fire up my presentation. So I'm going to try it, and hopefully this will work. I'm going to go share my screen. Can you see that? You should be able to see. Excellent. Okay. So we call this talk "Battling with Bits of Rubber," partly because one of the entirely self-serving things I want to point out is we have a podcast, myself and my friend Todd Debrasini. We have a podcast where we like to talk about the specifics of things, and we talk with other artists that do this kind of stuff about, you know, the problems that crop up when you're doing uh, practical things like this, and the issues that can happen are really where the job is, and they're the things that I will spend a lot of time talking about and dealing with in the job, you know. So we typically start once you've got your design ready and everything, you know what you're doing, you've got a brief and you've got a deadline, you've got a performer ready. You would do typically what's known as a life cast. So you would do an impression of the person's face. Here we're using silicone, but sometimes you might use alginate or plaster bandage and various other bits and bobs, depending on what you're doing. So here you can see kind of like the worst case scenario, we've got a full head life cast, the dreaded life cast. You'll notice there are no straws in the nose, because that's just a really, really bad thing to do, because if somebody jabs those straws, you'll just carve a nice groove in the back of somebody's nose. So you don't want to do a life cast with straws. Um, so we've got, you know, a silicone all over. What we'll do is keep the nostrils clear, obviously, so someone can continue to breathe, because it is quite important that you do not kill your actors. They do not like being slaughtered for the life cast. And we'll do a couple of layers of that, and then we'll put bandage over the top of that and pop that off. And the purpose of the bandage is to hold its shape so that it doesn't distort. And then we take off the life cast, and then we block up the nostrils once it's removed. So this is looking inside the life cast. You can see it has that curious kind of illusion of coming out, even though it's going in, because of just the way that the sort of light works, is that kind of illusion. So what we'll then do is fill that up. So I've got here another example of a life cast. I've kind of taped the two halves of the bandage together, and then you'd fill it with plaster, typically a soft-ish plaster that you could clean up. But I'm showing you these pictures because they're very good examples of where things can go wrong with life casts. So you may end up accumulating a lot of artifacts that are not part of the original person, like air bubbles or you know, bits where you miss, or in here where the hair has been compressed down with the ball cap. You can see the weight of the life cast material has pushed this down onto the top of the ear, which isn't something that is really on his head. It's the result of the life casting process. So I'd have to clean that up. And this was an extreme kind of thing. So I kind of did something quite drastic to remove that. So you get these tiny little bubbles inside the nostril you've got to clean up, tiny little imperfection of the skin, you can just pop those off. But the top of the head, as you can see here, was a bit of a problem. So the first thing I wanted to do was orient the head and shoulders so they were sitting at the right angle. So they've been sort of, they're jacked up on the back here just to hold the head in the correct angle, so it's looking upright. And then I plotted this in with plaster to get the position right. Then what I did was quite drastic. I decided to cut the top of the head off, because it was quicker for me to do that than to try and shave this down, because this is a pretty hard plaster. So if I just cut that off, I could cut that off in about 15 minutes, and I basically rebuilt the inside of the head. So I've removed the hair. And what we did was we took measurements of his head. So we knew the size of his head under the hair, because we could tighten, you know, a tailor's tape around to take the measurements. So what I did was reconstruct his head in plaster. So I packed it out with bandage and then fill it with plaster and basically scrape it down until we corrected the head to make the head a better shape. And it took me about 2 hours to do the whole thing. And it was easier to do that than to try and shave down the plaster that was already there. So So being able to handle plaster, and you can see the bottom of this is all dressed off neat and smooth. That's relatively quick to do if you know how to use plaster. You can do this with other things like clay, but I quite like doing this in plaster because it's one of the good things. I don't know if Val Charlton's watching this if she's here, but she was one of my tutors at college, and she was there when we were doing, I think 92 to 95 was when I was at college. And one of the best things that ever happened while we were at college is we had film industry plasterers teach us plastering, and so they showed us how to handle plaster, and it
She
really
is
made a big
here. She
difference.
just raised her hand. Should say
Hey,
that
there we go.
she's here. And, yeah, and for any of you who've watched some of these shows before, Val's actually done one of these shows. So anyway,
Yeah, that
sorry,
was
keep going.
amazing. That was so cool. And yeah, so we had, like Kenny Clark, we had plasters from back in the day who worked in the original Star Wars trilogy, showing us how to mix plaster, how to slow plaster down, how to speed it up, all the practical core things you need to do. And that stayed with me ever since. And I use that stuff, and I can throw this together in no time because I know what the plant materials are going to do. So it's a familiarity with the materials that lets you speed things up. So let's show you another example like us that didn't need that kind of fixing. So we might do a full head life cast like this. This went quite well. Much younger person, tighter skin, so you don't have any of the distortion pulling the hair around or the skin around. And that's one of the issues you can get with a life cast, is that the weight of the material can actually modify their real skin. So if they've got quite loose skin on there, the weight of whatever you put on can pull the skin down, which you wouldn't get with a scan, for example. So that's one of the limitations that I think life casting has. Um, but it came out quite well. But what will happen is I will clean this up. And then here on the left here, you can see this blue thing. This is a master mold. So basically, once the head is cleaned up, I will then take a mold of that head to be able to make others. Because one of the big things about this stuff is you often need to make duplicates of things. So you've got your original life cast, your performer comes in, you take a life cast of them, they go away, and then you've got a copy of their head. If you drop that head, that's it. You can't call Angelina Jolie to pop on a plane and come back again. So you have to make sure that you preserve the life cast that you have, and take good care of it. So here's an example of a face cast that I have cleaned up. You can see the hairline has been drilled in place, so we know where the hairline is. So that any pieces we make would electively be able to go over the hairline, or stay away from the hairline, depending what we want. And I've dressed down the sides here. You can see I've flared those out. So I need to make a copy of this so that we can make duplicates in different materials. So often we will use a material called silicone. So I'll dress on several layers of silicone, and each layer often is in a different color so that you can see where your first layer went, and you alternate the colors. And then once you've made your silicone mold, you can then pull that away, and you end up with a silicon duplicate, which is what we've got here. I'll just play this little video clip so you can kind of see what I mean by a negative. So that's a reverse of the life cast. So it's exactly the life cast, but in negative. So it's in reverse. And out of that material, I can cast out pretty much anything. So if we need 5 people to start sculpting on a makeup at the same time, we can produce 5 identical life casts from this mold. We don't need the actress again for that. So it helps to be able to duplicate things, and that's a big part of this kind of work. So what I would take with that life cast, once I've made that life cast, is I would mount it onto a board to start sculpting. So this would be another hard plaster that's completely cleaned up because it's from the original mold, and I painted it gray. And the reason I paint it gray is because I want to sculpt in a gray oil-based clay. So here's an example of where you block in your shapes, and this is where it stops being so processy and becomes like a creative bit. You have fun sculpting. So you do your sculpting on your life cast, and you model it up in whatever material you like to use. This is a gray plastiline, so it's, like I say, an oil-based clay, so it doesn't dry out, it doesn't shrink or crack like pottery clay would. And you can heat it up to soften it or cool it down to harden it. So if you want to modify its surface to do different textures, you can. But at this stage, it's very loose. So you can see I put it on little blobs, and you just kind of build it up. And you thrash out the sculpt. I kind of grew up learning this stuff and learning ZBrush now. Like, it's very nice that you can sculpt independently things where you sculpt on the left side and the right side at the same time because you've got your X symmetry switched on, which is fine for, you know, a symmetrical head. But in this case, we're dealing with a life cast, and one of the things that often is the case is that, you know, the human body is not symmetrical. So trying to do like hero suits where there are like certain lines and textures and patterns in that suit, it's very hard to reproduce them on both sides, because the first thing you have to do is make that thing symmetrical before you start committing to, you know, an identifiable pattern that would look wrong if the body wasn't symmetrical. But to make this look realistic, we're kind of deliberately putting in certain amount of asymmetry, but you try and strive for some symmetry. So I'll just go back to this. You will have blocked out your face, and just the problem with prosthetics is you don't really want one big mask. Sometimes you do if it's background, but if you want something that's very, very small, or it needs to move more realistically, often you will break that piece down into different smaller pieces that are logical molds. So you might make the cheeks separate, the nose and the top lip separate, the chin separate. Every piece is going to be different, but you always start with an initial one thing so you can see what it would look like finished. And then once you've done that, then you break it down into its sections. So this is where that life cast mold that we took earlier will come in handy. So I would take out a section of the face. So here I've got the right side of the face. I will obviously have done the same on the other side of the face too. And I've got my ear included in that. And I've broken the sculpt down. I've made a pattern here to show me where that particular piece finishes. And then I've extended out areas here to give me kind of redundant space around the outside of where the sculpt finishes. And those are going to be where keys go and things like that, because I'm going to put a mold on here, and I need the mold to marry up to this core exactly. So I need to put into the things now what I'm going to need later. So again, there's all this kind of processy kind of stuff, which is involving plaster. And then I'm going to make molds of those, and then I make these in resin. So here you can see the two sides of the face, and this is like an epoxy resin. So it's quite lightweight, very, very strong resin. And that will take a lot of pressure when we come to use clamps and straps later to hold the molds together. So we've got the neck, and this is the top lip, nose, and the forehead was in one piece, and we've got a chin as well. So here's an example of the sculpts now floated off and separated out, and I've got to blend the edges on each piece and tease them out, put the texture back in, repair any damage that was occurred. And you'll see here there's like a kind of a blanket of gray plastiline over the whole thing. And the purpose of that is to keep the mold away from the core, so that when we fill this up with the silicone, which we're going to make these pieces in silicone, the silicone only goes where we want it, and we can cut it out basically by having this blue line you see here on the outside edge. That's where the mold and the core touch down. They're called touchdowns. So this cutting edge here is touching down. And then these things here, the circular things and the sort of squarish shapes here, these are keys, and their job is to make sure that when I make the mold on here, that later on the mold and the core align perfectly every time. So every time you run an appliance in this mold, whoever's running it, when you squish the mold and the core together, they line up in exactly the right way, because obviously this has got some unique curvatures here which need to be copied in the mold exactly. So by putting keys in, we can kind of ensure that they'll align. So here's the neck piece here, all ready to go. And on the right hand side, you can see the mold. And for some reason, I managed to get my finger in the shot here, but you can see the blue gel coat that's gone over the top of this. So this is now going to make a duplicate of this shape, but in reverse. In the hard materials, there's the forehead and the piece as well. So once those are made, then we pop it out, clean it out. We can keep the clay as a guide to how much volume is going to need to fill this mold. But now I've got my mold and my core of that neck piece. And so these will work together. So if I put them together, they'll line up nicely and clamp shut. And the idea is that when you run your silicone, you really want to squish those down tight. So you put a lot of pressure on that mold. And that's one of the things that isn't obvious when you're doing this, is that these molds put under a lot of force. And in the old days when we used to bake everything in foam latex, you would want to put your mold in an oven for 3 hours at 100 degrees Celsius. So, you know, there were certain stresses and strains the mold would have to go through, perhaps hundreds of times. So you had to make the mold strong enough to withstand those processes as well. So, and making it lightweight, this is why it's hollow, is sensible. Again, if you were doing it in foam latex, if you were going to bake it in the oven, if it was solid, it would take longer to heat up and longer to cool down, and it would weigh more. So there were very practical considerations and reasons why you'd want to keep things light and thin, but also strong. And nowadays, a lot of molds are made out of this material because it's a much stronger material to use. The other issue you have, which is quite
But
tricky.
what was the mold? Someone said, are your molds made of resin? What was the material
Yes,
for
an
the?
epoxy mold. Yeah. So this is so that you have like a gel coat that you put on, which catches all the detail, and then behind that you have like an epoxy putty. There's a few different ones. This is called PSO3, and it's like a paste that you mix together. You put it in, you lay it in, and then it takes about 12 to 24 hours to cure, but you leave it overnight, and then that'll set up. And in the morning, you could drive a car over that, and that'll be, strong. So it's a nicer way of working. And the molds here, these were made out of polyester and fiberglass. So these are laminated, which is how we used to make a lot of molds, which was kind of an overhang from the foam latex days, because you always used to bake foam latex in fiberglass molds because they cook so quick because they were quite thin. But it stinks to high heaven, and it's just nasty working with fiberglass. But one of the problems you've got is obviously once the mold is closed, like here you can see this mold is closed, you've got to get your silicon into the mold, and you could fill it and then squish the mold in, but more often than not will either inject or let gravity fill it. So here you can see what looks like a drain hole where I basically drilled a bunch of holes into the back of the mold, and then you would put a tube in, and then when you fill it with your silicone, the silicon would go through those holes, fill the mold up. Here you can see these little bleed holes, and they let the air out. We'll see some more of these later. So that the silicon, once the silicon comes out of these holes, we know the silicon has made it to the edge because we can't see inside the mold, and then we can block those afterwards and then let that silicon set up, which may take a few hours, and then we can pop that piece out. The reason for these holes, by the way, rather than one big hole, is that when you take the piece out, you'll basically have what we call a nipple that sticks out the back of the piece. If that's, an inch and a half wide, that's a lot of silicon to snip through. So if I put 9 little holes in, the silicon can go into the mold, but then the back of the piece has these smaller holes, which is much easier to trim off. So, and here around the outside edge, you can see these are bleed holes here around site. Again, they just let the air out so that the silicon, can fill, and the air that was in there has somewhere to go. So you've got to think about where the air is going to go. These are some examples of pieces that were made. So this was a bottom lip and a chin piece. This is for a trade show we did a couple of years ago. And I love doing trade shows because one of the problems I have, as you can imagine, I'm sure it's the same for everybody that working in film, is that you sign non-disclosure agreements, which prevent you from having or showing pictures of things that you either don't have or shouldn't have. So what I love to do with trade shows is I can reveal the entire process of how I would work in advance of the show. And then I can, if people go to the show, they can see the makeup being stuck on, but I can document everything and show everything. So the processes here are mostly identical to how I would do it on a film, pretty much. And often you spend more time on them because you've got all the time in the world to do them. Um, these cores here, so these are finished pieces ready to go on, and they're going to be transported. So what you can see here are lightweight, rigid copies of those cores. So these don't weigh much at all. They're made out of an expanding foam, which is quite lightweight. And so if I had to ship, 20 sets of these pieces around the world in a box, it makes sense if every face it's sitting on isn't made of stone, because obviously that would weigh a lot and be more likely to break if it was dropped. Whereas this, a whole face like that probably weighs about 200 grams. So it's a nice way of transporting things. And this is why making master molds at the beginning is really important. So you can make duplicates of things for steps like this, where you may have to sort of send them away for hairing or painting or whatever's going to happen. Here on the left-hand side, you can see there's a series of holes. These are little air bubbles in the silicone. And they're one of the problems that can happen when you fill a mold, is you don't know until you open it up whether or not that piece is usable or not. So there's always a lot of fear around doing everything carefully and right and accurately to avoid these kind of problems. But something like this, where you'd see air bubbles, you basically have to kind of look at it and go, right, we need to fix this. So in this case, what I would do is I would mark where each one of these holes are on the core, and I would drill a hole through the core to let the air out at that point, because very often you'll find the air seems to collect in the same place just because of the unique undercuts and curvatures of the mold. So it's kind of getting to know your mold, and you find out in the first few pieces where your problems are going to be. Another problem that I had a while ago, this was for a different show, was that the cap plastic that you use as a barrier can come away from your silicone. So I was doing a different technique to get them out the mold. And so, this is another thing we had to diagnose what the problem is. I boiled down to a release agent that I was using, and it was impairing this barrier from sticking to the piece. So you've got all these different materials that work together to produce the finished thing. But it's like a chain. Any one of those links can kind of go wrong, and so you have to kind of diagnose what the problem is and work backwards. And it's quite an important mindset to be able to have, I think, is to be able to problem solve, because very often you may not even know how to ask the question, or B, there isn't time or anyone available to answer it. So you just got to sit there 3 o'clock in the morning crying, trying to figure out how to make it work, and call upon your friends to see, what kind of stuff they've got. Here's another example of an air bubble. It's kind of tricky to see. This is looking inside the back of a nose piece. So this is the nostrils looking inside the nose. And here you can see there's a little air bubble there, which wasn't a tragedy. I just filled it from behind with more of the same silicone. And that's a very easy thing to fix. So here's an example of one of the nice things about appliances that I like that you can make in advance. So you can pre-paint it to a degree, and you can also hair it here. So here, I'm personally no good at hairing, so I got a friend of mine, Patch, to do this hair punching. But it's nice that you can get things like hair punching done, because it means you can see each hair coming out from the skin. There's no wig lace in here. The disadvantage is obviously that if you need to do another shoot day, you need another set of appliances that have also been hair punched. So it can be quite labor intensive to do that kind of hair work on the pieces in advance. But being able to pre-paint them is helpful. I mean, this is quite a subtle paint job just to kind of get us underway. I would do more makeup once it's on. But if you had a very complicated creature with a pattern or something, or a tattoo or something like that on there, it's quite nice if you can do it in advance, because it minimizes chair time on set the next, whenever you're going to actually apply it for real. So pre-painting pieces is good fun. This was for a demo at a trade show. This is that makeup I showed you earlier that I was sculpting. So this is kind of order of sticking it on. So what you've got to do is obviously get your performer to sit in a nice comfortable chair, because they might be in it for a few hours. It helps if they can sit still. Not everybody can. Sometimes this will be happening at 3 a.m. So, they don't like you. They don't want to be wearing this stuff. So you've got to be, firing on all cylinders with all that sort of loathing going on at the same time. Some people love it. Some people love to look different, but some people hate it. So here I've got to get rid of some existing hair. So she's got hair, and I put a ball cap on just to hide that hair, and also glued down the eyebrows and painted those out. And that's important, because if you put a thin silicone appliance over somebody's eyebrows, if they've got pale skin and dark eyebrows, you might see those dark eyebrows showing through the appliance. So the first thing I've got to do is get rid of those by just painting them out. And obviously everything you're using on the skin wants to be safe to use on skin. So this is all kind of, makeup, and the glues are very expensive, prosthetic glues, because they're safe on skin, but they also come off. So, you can remove them at the end of the day. So you stick the eyebrows down, the hair's out the way. The first piece that went on was the throat, the neck piece, and then the chin and the bottom lip. And then the forehead with the nose and top lip. And then the cheek piece is under tucked this one. So I didn't glue the sides of the forehead, and then the cheek pieces went on, which included the ears. So these ears go over her own real ears, because I wanted to bring the face forward. I was after a kind of a slight Abraham Lincoln-y kind of thing, while widening the face. So the ears are sitting on top of her real ears, and then the forehead, this edge that was unglued, overlapped over the top. So the order in which you apply the pieces is quite important as well. And this was all done at a trade show. So again, quite high pressure, because you've got to do this in front of people who are watching and asking questions and taking pictures. And I quite like doing those, because I think if you can do a makeup whilst other people are asking you questions about it, you really learn about why you're doing what you're doing, and also about doing like 5 things at once, because often that's the case. You might be, sticking something on, someone's asking you how long you're going to be, somebody else wants to know what you want for lunch, they're changing the order of the shots, all kinds of stuff going on. So it's good to be able to handle those kind of pressures. There's another trade show going on. So here you can see a massive appliance here, all the way around, this big wraparound appliance. And I'm not averse to getting the talent to hold the glue for me, because that way it speeds the whole process up. It's also much less likely to get knocked over, because if you think you've got to reach over to the glue pot constantly, if the glue pot's 6 feet away from you, that's a lot of time you spend going back and forth. This is I put this in as an example of what can go wrong with pieces, because with appliances, what makes them work is when the edges disappear and the coloring is the same as the skin. So if you can make the edges vanish into the skin, and you can match the color of the piece to the person's skin, there isn't anything really to tell you that it's not real. So that's the kind of the highest kind of level you can go to. So that's what you're spending a lot of time doing. So this was for a magazine article to demonstrate precisely the problems that you will get. So here I had a piece that was fine, and then I completely destroyed it. I ripped it, I folded it, I shredded it, I pulled all the edges off to make it really, really obvious where the piece was on, and then went on to repair it to demonstrate, you know, how you fix it. So you lift up the edges, you put glue on, you can fill around, you can put patches on, and then once it was kind of done, there's still a few dodgy bits up here and there, but it was much, much better than it was. The idea being, if you can repair something, you know, that's a good skill to be able to have. Everybody wants everything to go well, but there's real value to be gained when things go wrong, and then you deal with that. And if you can quantify that and show somebody else how you do it, then they can do it too. So it becomes like a nice thing. And I love that about this kind of work, that you can kind of show people, you know, how to fix stuff. So we're going to do some stuff that's got blood and things. So I just thought I'd put this little warning up in case anyone's not here, but I'm pretty sure that's nobody here. So once you've got that piece on, you throw some blood on. And what's funny is, you know, this, you'll see this kind of stuff happen a lot on Instagram, and there's nothing wrong with the blood stuff, but the real work really was in making the piece not look like it was separate from the skin. That's where 90% of your work will go. Throwing some blood on is relatively straightforward. I mean, you can do it badly, but it's one of those things where you can work for weeks on something, then you put a bit of blood on, and at that point people go, oh, that's really cool. And it's like, yeah, but it's also the bit that anyone could do. So there's you know, a very a big payoff with blood stuff. Another one was this was for a show. This was, we did this for a trade show because a lot of people, especially on Instagram, we saw a lot of people doing like Coke cans in the eye and all that kind of stuff with real cans. They were cutting a can and sticking it on, and you know, the danger is if you sort of, someone whacks that can, or you walk into a door or something, then you will gouge your skin for real. And having done a fair few things like this for films and stuff, I wanted to show people the work that would go into it if you were doing it properly. um, because again, all of this stuff is, it's an illusion, and where the work has gone is not really obvious. So the first thing that would happen is, where are we? So got that. So the first thing that happened is I would make a mold of a real screwdriver. So I molded a screwdriver, and I made a lightweight duplicate. So here you can see this was 4 grams in total. And then the shaft of the screwdriver is just a straw, just a plastic straw. And we also made a cup that was basically based on the life cast, so it fitted the person's face. So we've got this kind of custom shaped plastic sort of plate that forms to the face, onto which I've glued a little spike here of aluminium. And the idea is that that then attaches to the cheek. So this is not glued to her eye. This is glued to her cheek under the eye, and then the edges have been blended out. So there's nothing on the eye at all. So the pressure and all that weight is taken on the cheekbone underneath, and then the spike is secured on there. And then over the top of that, you would then prepare your piece. So here's another example, like pre-painting the piece. So this is before we applied it. So I can put all this juicy texture in here, and then slide the piece over and then glue it in place. So now that spike is sticking out. But if you were to grab that spike and wiggle it around, it wouldn't hurt because it's secured to a much larger plate that's flat to the skin. And then once the piece is down, then you get rid of your edges, match skin tone, put the freckles in, warm up the colors, all that kind of stuff. And then you can stick your fake screwdriver over the top. And if you grab that screwdriver for real and yanked it, it would just break in your hands. So, because it's important that we don't hurt the actor. Because as well, if the performer's got something sticking out of their face, they forget where that is and they might bang into something. So you have to think about their safety. And it's far better to just make 10 screwdrivers that are breakaway and have them ready, rather than one that, you know, if they caught it on the door as they ran out the door in action, you know, and it yanks their head around, then suddenly you get sued for breaking your actor's neck. So you've got to think about these things. Here's an example of something we did for Game of Thrones. So this was working for Barry Gower. So he obviously had a big team. There were loads of different gags going on. And I think this was on the Hard Home episode, I think. There was a big fight between Jon Snow, I think, and he hits him in the head with his hammer. And what you're looking at is a combination of different things. So you've got here a hammer that was made by props. So I didn't make this hammer. This is a very nice, really nice lightweight prop that of the hammer. Underneath that hammer is like the screwdriver you saw before. There's actually a spike mounted to a plate that's on top of his head, that's under a big silicon appliance. And attached to that is a blood rig that would then bleed on cue. So you've got about 4 or 5 different elements in this one thing to go together, make the whole thing kind of work as a gag. And obviously the thing is you could clean that up and then repeat the shot. So if you needed to take 2 or 3 takes, you could. And the whole thing kind of worked when it was edited together quite nicely. But this hammer weighs almost nothing. It's amazing how well they made that. Um, Another one, a nice blood rig here. Not that evident in the shot, but when you see it close up, it's quite nice. So basically, he's got a plate on his neck that holds a blood rig, and then over the top of that is an appliance. So this is something that Barry Gower and I worked on. We did this test maker, and it worked really, really well. Um, but what is important that isn't obvious is that she's got a retractable sword, which is great. But what if, for some reason, that retraction mechanism was blocked? And she actually did push the sword into his throat for real. How would we know? Because he's supposed to be spitting blood and, you know, panicking the shot, which is his action. So you don't want to accidentally hurt. So he's actually got a Kevlar plate that fits his neck, that has a catch on it to receive the tip of the blade, so that when she pushes hard, it doesn't skid off its position, it stays in place. So you've got to think about all those things as well as the blood rig, and then over the top it's got to look like skin. So again, it's all those things you've got to worry about, and you spend a lot of time making that are not going to be seen, but if you don't do them, then bad things could happen. So you need to make sure that you take all your precautions. This was another one working for Barry Gower. This was for an episode where Pip gets an arrow to the neck. So this arrow is quite hard to see, but there's an arrow there that was made of paper, really nice prop that the props department made. And so we made a plate that goes underneath that. And one of the things I was very, very careful about was making sure that you can't really see it because it kind of snapped off, but that the arrow aligned, because I hate it when you see things going in and coming out the other side of the body that are not in line. So we spent a lot of time making that a rig that aligned the two halves of the arrow so they were accurate. And then the beauty is the arrow could be popped on and off in between takes, so he didn't have to walk around all day with an arrow in his neck. And again, he has to bleed, and like it's like the law on Game of Thrones where everyone has to have a beard, which from a makeup point of view is a nightmare, because where this piece finishes is right where his beard is. So often we would have to kind of glue some of the beard down, apply over the top of that beard hair, and then apply hair back over the top to hide the edge. So again, once it's done well, you don't really see it. But again, you can't have people just shaving beards, because they may need to be in the shot later with their beard again. So you have to work with what you've got. This was working for Millennium Effects. This was on a film called League of Extraordinary Gentlemen, and this was a cutaway scene where Mina Harker goes vamp mode. And I don't know if you would see this, but she's wearing a foam latex appliance around the face and also on her hands. And this was before we were using silicone, really. So this was all foam latex. So I would have sculpted this and molded it and applied it. And she's got some fangs in there and some contact lenses that would have been applied by, you always have contact lens technicians doing that stuff, because you know anything to do with eyes, that's kind of a medical device. You don't want to be touching anything to do with eyes, so we always have to have a lens tech as well do the eyes. So we've got that. This was from a movie called Guest House Paradiso. So this is at Ealing Studios, which was an absolute joy to work on. So you had Adrian Edmondson and Rick Mayall from like The Young Ones hitting each other, you know, in a set at Ealing Studios. It was perfect. So Simon Pegg plays a guy called Mr. Nice, and he gets picked up by a nipple ring in his sleep. So he's got a nipple ring on this thing, and there's a mechanism underneath here that holds a nipple ring in place because it gets pulled with a fishing line. And then over the top of that is this big chest appliance, which went over the top. Again, it's this stuff is all the stuff that where your work is underneath and hidden, and then the piece over the top, that's just sort of window dressing to kind of hide that. This was for a TV show called Hex. So you got these kind of funky little ears, and he just kind of vamps out as a kind of demonic kind of character. He's a preacher, I think, and then turns into this demon for a flash. So he's shot against green screen, and then they comp that in afterwards. So I think we had to sculpt this in like a day. It was a bit of a rush job, but there you can see me with hair but no beard, and airbrushing his veins in. This was probably about 20 years ago. So yeah, it was a fun little job to do. And he also gets stabbed in the neck. So this is a nice gag to show you where a practical, this was entirely practical, this part. So basically he has some scissors in his neck that are then going to be spun with the master's evil power. So he kind of makes them go like that, which was kind of fun. And I could just do that all day. He actually says that in the camera, I could do this all day. But This was filmed in a church in Camden somewhere. So a nice practical effect, made up of several different things. A really, really clever mech called Gustav Hogan made the mechanism for this. He's gone on to work on things like Star Wars and stuff since, and he's making beautiful mechs. So he made the mechanism for that. And then I think the props were made. These prop scissors, they're not real scissors. They were made, I think, by Keir Lusby. I think. Back when there was Keir Lusby back at Shepperton Studios. So they made a prop set of scissors, and they were mounted onto a disc so they could be removed. So the scissors stopped there. And then over the top of that, I made this big appliance. And often you make pieces bigger than you think you need to because you're not sure what the costume is. So we wasn't sure if he was going to be wearing a costume. So we come down quite low, and there's a plate on his neck so that supports the mechanism. And then my appliance goes over the top of Gustav's mech, and then we slide on the scissors over the top. And as you can see, the beauty was he could do all that in shot. This was for Shaun of the Dead. And so this is me in 2003, I think, doing a little test of some gut tearing for David, was the character name, Dylan Moran's character. He gets pulled to pieces, so we had to make these tearaway chests. And I think Stu was saying, show us the ribs. So I'm like gleefully tearing at his chest and then showing you the ribs. And then there's all that kind of fatty. There was more blood in there, but for the test, we didn't put too much blood in because we wanted you to see the bits and bobs. This was more recently. This was for a show called Giri Haji, which is was on BBC, and it's one of those shows that was really good. I mean, the production values are fantastic, but it's not one of those shows that many people have seen. But it's still an iPlayer, I think. And there was a series of fingers that got chopped off. It was like a Yakuza kind of crime drama thing. And so the makeup designer was Vicky Lang, and she did a really nice job of designing all the makeups and everything. And there were these a couple of scenes where the fingers get chopped off, and we had to make fake hands with fingers that could be removed and then reset and shot in camera. I believe there was some digital cleanup and stuff for these scenes, so you can kind of see there the scene line where the cut was going to happen. So he has one finger removed, but that's not enough. The boss wants more, so he has to have a second finger cut off. So I had to do two versions of his hand with different fingers, and this whole thing is rigged to bleed. So there's tubing going all the way through here, and you can see the tubing there coming out. And this the other guys. This is the other character's finger that also gets cut off there. So we basically took life cuts of their real hands in those positions, and then I would clean up the sculpts, make molds of them, and then duplicate them in silicone. And then once this mechanism was done, I made a video showing everyone how the mechanism worked. We boxed it up, and then it went to Japan, and then I didn't see them again until the thing came out. So, but I didn't hear anything bad, so it must have worked okay. And then we had to make some things like these fake fingers that were slipped on over the actor's fingers, because he was supposed to look like a lot of Yakuza people don't want to look like they're missing fingers. So they have these fake fingers that they put on over the top. So he would wear that. And this curious device, which was, and I think there was some digital stuff in there, but one of the things that was confusing was to know exactly how something was going to be done. So I would do what I could practically, and then there wasn't a massive amount of information between departments about how this effect was going to work. And I'm not sure if it's because the production weren't sure either, or, and I'm sure you probably will appreciate this, but often people don't listen to your concerns early enough until it's too late. So often you would say, look, we need answers about how we're going to do this. So one of the things I did was this is his finger that is supposed to have been removed. So he actually has his real finger taped over and then a fake stump that slides over that. But I wasn't sure if they would remove because you can see here, this is where his finger was bent over. So it was taped over. So this would sit over the top. So I made one that was kind of like pinky and the others I painted black so that they wouldn't be seen. But I wasn't sure if they wanted me to paint it black and then that would be easier to take out, or if it was better if it was more like skin color and then they could take it out. I wasn't sure. So this is a good example of how, you know, different disciplines that are using different materials and different processes but trying to get to the same end. If they could speak the same language or have a common ground, it would be easier to make this effect work. And I'm not sure if it was an editing thing or, you know, whether they cut that out or how it worked, but it was a fun thing to do. So I made these very curious looking fingers, this part black, like I say, you could slide them on and off, because what you don't want to do is something that requires an extensive application every time it goes on. So what you would see in the shot ideally is this thing on the right, where it's just the stump with the bit missing, and then not see this darker thing underneath. So there we go. That is my presentation. So I'm going to press stop share, and then hopefully
Amazing.
you'll have some
Really
questions.
great. Yeah, there's loads of questions. And there was a couple at the beginning that were only made sense in context. So if you guys, I might skip those, but if you guys want to resubmit those, then I'll take a look.
Sure.
This one got uploaded. Do you have any tips for coloring a realistic skin tone on a prosthetic?
I do. I wonder if I could. I'll tell you what I'll do whilst we're doing this, because I've got. I have done a number of blog posts about that, and one of the things I did was a workbook about that. So I will put that in the notes here in a second. Yes, basically the thing is you've got to. It depends on your appliance. Because you need to make sure that your appliance is a good color to begin with. So if you're making it out of silicon, for example, it's perfectly possible that you could make your piece the wrong color to begin with, and then I'll just put that there. So that's a link to a blog post, and on there you will find a downloadable workbook I did as well, a free booklet about this in more detail, because it's got pictures and illustrations, things. But basically the idea where a lot of people go wrong is they make their appliance the wrong color to begin with, and then the act of making up is to fix that. Really what you want to do is you want to get the base tone of the appliance itself close to the skin tone but slightly paler, and then you can darken when necessary with makeup. So I would use if it's silicone, you want to use silicone pigments to get the right color. And then you don't want to apply a lot of makeup if you can help it, because the more makeup you put on, the more it's going to look cosmetic, particularly with prosthetics that are supposed to look like real skin. You want to get most of the coloring in the appliance itself, and then very, very thin washes over the top. And one of the hard things I think people have when they're trying to paint skin tones is to reproduce realistic skin. What you don't want is like a masky, even flat color. You want it to be broken up like real skin is. So you really need to study what real skin looks like. One of the best things I think, if you get serious about doing makeup, is to get those. It was Maria Manucheri. She's a tutor at a college, and she put me onto this, and they're fantastic. They're little magnifiers that you wear over your glasses, and they have a light on them, and you can use them for studying your skin. And they're really good because you can actually see your own skin. Just look at it, you'll see all the tiny little colors that are in there, and you make a note of those colors. And skin is just full of blues and yellows and reds and all those kinds of things. So by putting the colors into the skin and on the surface through flicking or texture, you actually don't make it one flat color. And that would be, a good way to start with something that looks reasonably natural and avoid flat, smooth, foundation-y kind of looks. I could go on about that for hours, but I
Great.
realize you've already
Yeah.
got too many questions.
People are discovering you can upvote questions, so please go for it, and I'll pick the ones off the top that people most want
Okay.
to hear about. So, because we have over 20 now, so I don't know if we get everything. Do you prefer using silicone or alginate when making props such as hands?
Oh, you mean for live casting, I suppose. If I'm live casting, I still like alginate. Silicone is nice, but it takes longer. So it all depends on the person, really. If I'm doing a live cast of hands, what's good about alginate is you can take an alginate off of a hand and then fill it straight with silicone, and then you've got a silicone prop, assuming your life cast has gone well, and then that speeds it up. And then, it might be quicker to do 5 hand casts and just fill each one with silicone, and then you've got a silicone prop. It uses more material, but it's quicker in time. Whereas if you do a silicon life cast of a hand and you want to get a silicon out of that, you're trying to get silicon out of silicone, and then you might get the silicone bonding unless you release it well. So it can be like actually quicker to do them in alginate. For head casts and stuff, I kind of like silicone, but some people don't like sitting for a life cast, and so alginate's quicker. But life silicone will give you a nicer finish, I think, and it's a slower, more relaxed process. But it all depends on the person, really. If someone's a bit twitchy, it might be just as well to go on with alginate. But if they're quite calm and relaxed, if they scuba dive or they've had it done before or something, then I might go with silicone, because it will give me, for selfish reasons, it gives me a nicer cast, and I can do it at a slower pace, a bit more relaxed.
Oh, this was a good one for this audience. What's your opinion on CGI and how it is affecting the role of the makeup artist? Do you think the two can work together?
I do. That crops up a lot, because one thing that I know most of the visual effects people, or all of the visual effects people, understand very well. A lot of the makeup people may be shocked to hear is that the computer doesn't do the work for you. You still have to be skilled with it. So there's still work to be done. I mean, one of the things is that I think what it's affecting things in that the quality of digital stuff is so good now that it's unrealistic to think it's not going to have an influence. But also I think it's being fractured down into so many sub departments and so many different skill areas that there are certainly things you could do practically that you could also do digitally, for example, like 3D printing, like digital sculpting, either because you want to do something as a concept or you actually want to make a genuine asset that can be used later. So I think people who sculpt in clay can also sculpt in ZBrush. I don't believe there's a dividing line. So CG will definitely continue to be a big part of it, obviously, and will grow and improve. But when people start making a distinction between I am this or I am that, there are digital people and there are practical people, then it becomes a bit, I don't believe that separation needs to exist. I think it's more about learning how to use computers in your work so that you are speaking a similar language. And over time, I think they'll kind of coalesce into a sort of under the same kind of canopy rather than being very separate. Like I said, with that finger, that's a good case in point. It's like, I don't know the words to say exactly what, but maybe if we were sat in a room over a coffee, we could have thrashed it out. But, you know, whoever's head of this and head of that, they're not going to necessarily get together because they're not in the same room or anywhere near each other. So whereas if you could speak the same language, it would be like, you know, easier to have that conversation. But I think they can help each other out. I think it makes sense to do things practically that are easiest done practically. And one of the things I noticed on when we did stuff on Game of Thrones is that there's so much digital stuff happening on the sky and the floor and changing colors of things you wouldn't even think were going to be changed because they look so real, you don't know they were done. It didn't occur to me that the digital guys there, the visual effects department, were looking for more things to do. They had plenty to do, thank you very much. So anything that you could do well in your role as makeup that meant they didn't have to fix it in post was a good thing. So it wasn't a case of like, oh, we can just leave sloppy edges on that because they'll clean them up. There's still a place for good work. So I don't think one replaces the other. I think it's more a case of uh, what makeup can do can be affected by digital. You can get take away rods and things, or you can make practical elements that can be composited in later. But also, you can look. I mean, look at like Masters Effects. Todd Masters has a company called Masters Effects, and they have a show reel. I think they still have that show reel, and they do both. They do practical stuff and digital stuff. And I think one of the good things is no one knows better how convenient and how much time is saved on something like a blinking eye effect than somebody that's had to make a blinking eye mechanism. So if you need like 3 eye blinks and you can do that in post, then please do, because it's not something you'd want to make for such little screen time. So I think they can work off each other.
Yeah, and is it, while we're on that topic, is there any good examples of how you've incorporated CGI into your workflow, or maybe a specific example of where there was some kind of, you brought something halfway and it was handed off and then sort of finished in digital? Is there any interesting examples of either of those things?
There have been some makeups and stuff that I mean, from my point, I mean, I didn't have any input into the digital aspect of it, but like when we were doing Game of Thrones, we had like a couple of weeks where it was just like days of filming, and so you would choose different performers. You'd be like, all right, today you're going to have a visual effects element, so you would make a section of the body, you would do your makeup, and then you would say, right, we're going to get rid of his arm or something. So we would dress, a wound stump around where the wound was, where the limb was going to be missing, for example, or if he had a hole in his body, we make the appliance edges, and then the center of that was painted green, and that was all something that might be on anyone's department. So and then when you see the shot, you'd see the limb taken out look really, really cool. So there were lots of things like that, and loads of things where you might be doing something that needs cleaning up, or something's gone wrong, like spraying blood is a good example. Like you try and get the blood to go in the right place, and sometimes it doesn't, because it's just blood, it's flying out at pressure, and so they need a bit more dense, so they might clean something up or something like that. So there's been lots of little things like that. And again, that Giri Haji thing, I still don't know. I would love to talk to the people that actually did those shots to find out what the thing was, because I think when you get a very long chain of command, it's very hard to get to the nub of something that's probably a very straightforward problem, but there's a protocol about how you talk to people, especially when things become that numerous, the crew's that big and they're all in different places. Um, so there is that. And for my own part, I mean, I don't do like visual effects at all, but I'm learning ZBrush. I use 3D printers. I've got 3D printers in here, and I started doing things this year. I did some stuff where I did some teeth. Then I made some teeth for a makeup that was sculpted digitally and printed those. And then if there wasn't, but if there was a visual effects element, I could have handed those over and they'd be the same teeth, you know, and things like that. So I'm trying to because no one's sort of taking me under their wing and showing me how to do this. It's not how it works. So I'm trying to kind of climb up bit by bit to try and learn this stuff, because I can see genuine real world benefits in knowing how to sculpt something digitally and how to print stuff and all that kind of thing. But also that doesn't stop me being able to sculpt in clay. So they're kind of merged, you know what I mean? They're slowly doing both. There isn't like, oh, if you pick up a Wacom pen tool, that's it. Your makeup just turns into smoke and disappears. It's like you can do both. But one of the things I find that's difficult is that a lot of makeup schools don't have like 30 years of practical and digital experience to draw on to teach the current students, because it's quite new. And so I think over time we're going to see a kind of, I only saw this recently in a magazine where they were mentioning hybrid artists that can do both, and there are certainly people out there far better than myself, like Martin Rizard and Simon Weber, and people who started with clay who are now, you know, pretty much full on practical digital stuff that can sculpt, and they do concept stuff for, you know, Star Wars and things. And presumably the things that they sculpt, which before would have been concepts, are now actual things we could, you know, hand over, and they can become used. So that kind of shortens the chain and also removes a whole bunch of processes if you do things practically. So I'm quite excited about how that could work, where you might remove certain toxic materials out of the process, because you don't need to fill up a skip full of molds now, because we can, if you can produce something three-dimensionally digitally, at what point do you really need its physical appearance? That maybe that's way off, I don't know, but I would love to be able to sculpt something and then see it mapped in real time onto a face and acted in the shot. That would be amazing, you know, on a monitor, because that way you could see for real. And you're seeing that with, you know, Facebook, and has those silly filters or whatever where it maps something to your face, and it's quite basic and it's free. So it's like, well, slap another 20 years on top of that. At the end of the day, whether or not it's going to look good comes down to whether or not you can sculpt and have a good idea. And that's always been the case, whether you're dealing with rubber or clay. So in a way, the job hasn't really changed. It's just a different set of tools, but it seems an incomprehensible set of tools to most people like myself, who were brought up on, you know, The Evil Dead and The Howling and all those kind of movies from the 80s, which is what, you know, threw me into it. So it's a case of being young enough to want to have the energy and the time to learn stuff, but also appreciating that it still involves skill. You can't just pick up ZBrush and become a great sculptor. I found out very quickly what my sculptural limitations were, because I can get to them quicker with ZBrush, because I realized, oh, that doesn't look good because I don't know what a shoulder looks like from the back, you know, rather than because the program doesn't work. It's down to me. So
So we're approaching the end of 1 hour. Do you have time to kind of roll over past the hour,
I
or
do,
do you need
yeah, I can
to?
keep going if you
Okay.
want.
So yeah, I'll just, because there's so many questions and it seems a shame not to try. We won't get through all of them certainly. I'll
I
try to
might
get
start
through.
giving shorter answers, which is going to
Yeah,
pain me to do, but I
yeah,
can't spend 20 minutes on each question. So,
yeah. But what we can go over, and obviously if you need to go, and if you can stay, great.
sure.
I like this question, which was, how do you gather references for accuracy? Are you looking at medical sources?
Yes, if it's if it's a medical thing, definitely. I mean, one of the things I think is really important is that you read about it as much as you do. We on our podcast we spoke to Daniel Parker recently, who was the designer for Chernobyl, and he was talking about how he had a hard time trying to find visual reference because the whole thing was supposed to be suppressed. Like Russia wasn't happy about this at all. So they didn't want lots of pictures of people in, you know, their horrible states as the radiation took over. So finding a real reference to the real thing was quite hard. What he could do was track down books that explained what happened to the body with, so he would read about it. So as much as visual reference is definitely important, you should also, depending on how serious the job is, if you're doing like a serious crime drama or something, then it's probably a bit more important than if it's just like a throwaway gag in a, a comedy show or something. But if it's got to be sort of accurate, then yeah, I would say reference material is very, very good. Like if you can get good books are still fantastic if you can get hold of them, or the internet is full of horrible things that you can get good reference of. The trick really is to understand the medical terminology. I mean, I'm not a doctor. I'm not saying I know the medical terminology, but what I'm trying to say is if you have something in your script that needs to be reproduced, try and find out what that thing is called. Try and track down a medic friend or on a forum or something, and then see if you can find out what that's called. So instead of looking up, for example, bullet hole, don't use that as your search term. Use gunshot trauma and then put in treatment of gunshot trauma, complications of gunshot trauma, examples of gunshot trauma treatment. If those are your search terms, you're more likely to find real images than just putting bullet holes, because you'll just get thousands of makeup school blogs doing, their wax wounds. And that, although it's good to look at other people's makeups, if you're trying to reproduce reality, you really do need to go back to reality and try and use primary resource, which is not nice to do. But then if you're trying to do radiation burns, it's not nice, and so it's got to look correct. But yeah, reading is good as well as image. And the other thing, that somebody asked this question a while ago and they didn't even know, check your Google settings to see if you've got safe search on, because it may be that the images you're finding are not there because there's a default setting which is preventing you from seeing all the horrible things. Or use a different search engine, Firefox or DuckDuckGo or something like that. But yeah, it's not nice.
Well, certainly, I mean, this is a field for people who either are not averse to kind of gross, gory things, or actually kind of get a kick out of it, right? Like it's
Well, they
not for
can, but
squeamish people, you know.
it flips both ways. I mean, what you don't want is to use it as cover for ghoulish activity. I mean, I don't sit and read these books as I'm going to bed. You know what I mean? It's one of those things where you need to read about it, but at the same time, you care about the process of how it's done. If you suddenly realize this is just sort of salacious for you, then maybe you need to get help. Yeah, it's just, I defy anybody to see some of that stuff and go, "Oh no, that's not nice." And the
Yeah.
older I get, the more squeamish I get about those things. But what your
But
job
maybe you
is,
take like sort of a doctor's attitude towards it after a while.
yeah,
Like
you
you're sort of
start, yeah.
you're
I mean,
studying it and you're really
yeah, it
looking
can
at it
become
critically
interesting. Yeah, it
rather
can
than
become, yeah,
once you get past that initial sort of you can
yes,
sort of just like a doctor has to.
yeah. And the more you get
But
used to your material, like I've got books that I've had for years, so I'm used to them. But the first time you see an image for the first time, that's when it's a bit shocking. But yeah, if you can read about it and learn what it is you're seeing, you start seeing it in terms of shape and color and form, and then it can be something you can reproduce because you're seeing it in those terms rather than as a person, or
um, this is a question. They said, do you use any digital drawing apps for creating your designs, or maybe to broaden the question, how do you create designs? Do you start with a drawing? Do you start with playing with clay? Like how do you design?
I'm really bad at drawing. So having drawing apps is good. I mean, I'm an Android boy, so I don't have an iPad. I'd love one of the iPads with the Procreate, but I don't have that. So I bought like a cheap Android tablet. So I've been using Infinity Paint, I think it's called, or Painter Infinity, something like that. That's quite a nice app. But normally it starts as an idea, just a vague notion, and I will doodle with pencil. But sometimes I'll do it digitally as well, just to kind of a loose idea, just to get the idea out of my head and onto paper. It won't be a good drawing, it won't be very accurate, but it's something that will at least remind me of what I thought. And then I will usually block out a sculpt in ZBrush, because I can sculpt quicker than I can draw. And again, even though it might be rough, it's still easy to manipulate, because I think the thing about a drawing on paper is that you make marks that's kind of feel permanent, even though you can rub them out. Whereas when you're doing stuff digitally, you can constantly move it. It's always fluid. So I kind of like ZBrush for that as well. I actually found a new lease of life sculpting things digitally, because it frees me from that fear. And you can always draw it or take an image from a certain angle without having to redraw the whole thing again if you want to see it from the other side. So personally, for me, something like ZBrush is good. And if you want to get the free one, I mean, there's ZBrush Core Mini, I think it is, which is free. And on the iPad and on the Android, there's Nomad, which is like a 15 quid, I think. It's like a digital sculpting app. So it doesn't have to be an expensive thing at all to try out. But yeah, ZBrush is good, and doodling. And then yeah, for me, once it's in 3D, then I can kind of see it. But I have a hard time. I can't render a beautifully rendered idea. I'm not Dave Elsey. Dave Elsey can paint this beautiful picture, from his head in Photoshop. It looks amazing. I'm like, wow, you can see what's good. Like, I can't do that. So if I can do it, you certainly can. Do you know what I mean? Because I'm an idiot when it comes to that.
This is from Sophie, who says, I'm a student currently studying special effects makeup and moving on to life casting. What is your biggest tip for a beginner?
To make sure you have a good subject. If your first live cast, if you can live cast somebody that's um, together, because the thing is, live casting can be quite stressful for the person underneath it, but by far it's stressful if they're nervous and you're nervous. Presumably you're being supervised, but if you could live cast anybody, if you could live cast somebody that's had it done 20 times before, you will probably do a better job because you won't have to manage them as much. So it would be quite nice if you could do your first live cast on someone that's quite willing to have it done. If someone's a bit nervous and not sure, but you've sort of corralled them into it, that might not go as well. But typically what happens is it's fine. It's the anticipation of what's going to happen that's the thing. The other thing I would say, if you're nervous or the person's nervous, is you don't have to do the full face. Maybe just do half, do one side, or from the nose down or something, so you can get used to the material. Because once you kind of familiar with how the material works, you can be more confident with it. But you don't have to start with the face. You could do a hand or a shoulder or something, or a knee or a foot or something, just to get used to the material, and then go on to the face as well. I know material cost is in it is a thing, in which case I would suggest maybe just doing that much of the face. So you do the nose and the top lip, because then they've got their ears. Because I've found if someone's gonna go wobbly on you in a life cast, it's once all of their senses have been robbed at the same time. If they can't hear and they can't see and they can't speak, then it's a thing. Whereas if maybe their eyes are covered or their ears are uncovered, they can at least hear what's going on, then they can be fine with it. I'm building it up as this big scary thing. It's not that big a deal, really. It's like I say, it's the anticipation of it that people build up into their heads, this fever pitch event, and it's like it's fine. It's really fine. So yeah, as long as you're correctly supervised and everything's been demonstrated and you know what you're doing, it should be fine. But yeah, my advice would be try and live cast somebody that's very okay with it, who's very calm and collected.
Sorry. How do you create skin texture when creating the molds?
When you're sculpting with plastiline, I've done a few videos on skin texturing. I might just pop the link in here. Basically, you need to use tools. Because the thing is, when you rough out your forms, you have your basic shapes. um Sorry, I'm just going to save this link. You want to make sure that you're sorry, I've got to copy the link. Okay, I want to paste that before I forget, otherwise I'll be annoyed that I forgot to do this. So that's a link to skin textures. um when you've blocked out your shapes and you've kind of smoothed it with tools, when you start doing textures, it can feel like you're vandalizing what was up till this point a nice thing. So it always feels a bit weird to start texturing. So I'm not that precious about making it smooth to begin with. That's one thing I would say. I use a lot of coarse sponges to smooth it out. So I just kind of sand it with that to kind of knock back the roughness, rather than, like, I see people smothering it with Vaseline and trying to polish it. Please don't do that, because it just makes it into an oil slick and then you can't add anything to it. And then I often will use, for pores, I'll use like little loop tools where you'll scoop bits out. But the first 20 or 30 pores you do will always look wrong, because what you've got is a smooth surface with 20 holes in it. You're like, what is that? But when there's another 1,000, there's enough of them to look like they're supposed to be there. So it'll always feel a bit weird at first. Oh, have I not sent you the same one? Sorry. It is, let me very
I
point.
think you're right. We've got
Cool.
first one says skin textures, second one says skin tones. Or no,
Skin
you know what? I
textures.
think that's my fault.
There you go. I'm glad you pointed that out. Although that one's, yeah, those two. Oh, the first one with textures, was it? Anyway, they're all there now. Sorry. And then there are different ways. One of the things about sculpting texture is that you don't do it in one hit if you build it up in layers. So I tend to do like the tooling with like a loop tool. So I'll either scoop tiny bits out or I'll dent it through plastic lots of times, and then you polish that down with a coarse sponge, the same kind of sponge you get in fish tank filters or air conditioning filters, or a stipple sponge. If you're a makeup artist, you'll use a stipple sponge. It's the same stuff. It's called reticulated foam or Scotch foam, and you can get different grades, different size holes. And the coarser it is, the more aggressive it will be. But you can basically, what I'll do is I'll put the texture in quite quickly and then knock it back with the sponge, and then that kind of softens it. And then you can go in again, but more gently. And then once you've got something there, then you feel confident enough to advance and enhance it. But when you first do it, it always feels weird, because it's like the first strip of wallpaper you pull off a wall. It's like, ooh, you feel like you're damaging it. But once all the wallpaper's off, it looks great. But the first time you do it, like, it just feels like you're interfering with that surface. So it's worth practicing that on a board. There's a very nice videos of a sculptor called Don Lanning, and he's done these really nice videos for the Stan Winston School, and he's basically made like a panel like a couple of feet square and covered it in plastiline, and you just practice sculpting wrinkles, sculpting pores, sculpting, so you don't do it on a finished sculpt. You just go through the process of practicing making pores, practicing making wrinkles, without that the nerves of, but I've spent 3 weeks sculpting the face before I did the texturing, so now you're invested in it so much you're paralyzed by indecision. So if you can actually just go through the process of reproducing these textures on a flat bit of plastiline, then that way you can kind of exercise that and get a feel for it without unleashing yourself and feeling like you're going to damage something that up to this point has gone pretty well, and now I'm about to pull the trigger on something that may ruin it, which it won't, but that's the fear.
There's so many questions. I don't think we're going to get through all of them. They're really good
Well, you could
questions. So
always
I'm
send
sorry.
them through and I
Yeah.
could do a separate video or audio post afterwards or something.
Yeah, you know what I'll do is I'll email all of these to you in
Okay.
case you want to post them, maybe send them when they would find them if you're going to be able to have time to look at more. I like this question. What did you make the fake body for Shaun of the Dead out of to rip apart? And what did you make the fake hands and fingers out of?
I think the hands and the fingers were all silicone, if I recall, but the chest, it was Stuart Conrad that ran that job at Animated Extras. And I think it was Stuart Conrad's idea. I think because he'd done it for something like Stuart Conrad is one of those guys that you should know. If you're interested in makeup effects, you should look him up and look at his IMDb, because he's worked on like Brain Dead and Hellraiser and some of the really early 80s and 90s horror movies. Fantastic. And I think it was his idea to use hot melt vinyl for the body, for the skins. So the body itself was made out of fiberglass, so it's like a torso that was hollowed out with the ribs. That was all fiberglass, and then inside of that were the guts that were basically hot melt vinyl. So you would heat up vinyl till it's molten, which is lethal and disgusting, and you have a big vat of cold water, like a big bucket full of ice cold water, and you slowly pour the vinyl mold into that, and it instantly cools, and it cools into very organic shapes that you can sculpt. So all those guts, all those stringy guts that you pull out, that was all vinyl mold. So they're pretty quick to make. So that was the inside of the guts, and then the skins over the top, that was, I think, like I say, I assigned that to Stuart Conrad. I'm pretty sure that was his idea. So we'd had the skin, the sculpt, we sculpted to the chest, and then brushed into the mold layers and layers and layers of vinyl mold. So it was hot and skin color. You brush it in, let it cool down, and then you would build up layers and layers, drizzling it on. I think we had this idea of sticking like a paint mixer paddle in a drill into the vinyl mold, then holding it over the body mold, pulling the trigger, and it would throw out loads of strings of vinyl mold that would instantly cool when they landed on the surface. And you build them up till it was about 2 inches thick. And then you painted a layer on the back, and it basically sealed it all in, and you'd inject it with blood, and you basically had this squishy skin that was all bits, and if you pulled it, it would come apart. It looked really, really cool. So the body itself was fiberglass. Where the arms and legs were broken, they're basically pre-cut with loops, and we basically used cable ties that were cut partially through, so when you yanked them, they broke. Sometimes they didn't. That was another take, but you'd have to cut them enough so that they would break when pulled, but not so much that they would just fall apart. And then it was a case of editing that body into real footage of him being manipulated to a point. Then they would cut, then we put the body in, then you pull the limbs off, and then it was just bits. So it was sort of done in 3 or 4 different stages and then edited together quite nicely. But yeah, so silicone for the limbs, vinyl mold, or I think Jelly Belly is another version of vinyl mold for the body, skin, and then the actual frame of the body itself is fiberglass.
I remember from Val's presentation, she was talking about for one of the earlier kind of Monty Python films, she had casted some, I think it was like cow organs or something like that to get this like really kind of gross skin texture, and then just kind of use that over and over again. Have you ever kind of cast any sort of weird or unexpected stuff to get like certain
Yes.
kind of textures and
Yes. Yeah, for Alexander the Great, we had real cow bits. So we had a pair of lungs, we had a liver, a kidney, we didn't have any intestines. We tried to get some, and we had a heart. And so what I did was I molded most of them except the lungs, because we didn't need lungs in the end. But we basically molded them and took loads of reference photos, and then I made duplicates from the mold. So we take the heart, for example, molded the heart, then took out, filled the mold with molten plastiline, cleaned it up, and then made a silicon version of that. So there was a scene where I can't remember where in the movie it was, but there's like a kind of, they're trying to predict the outcome of a battle. So you'd have this tray and this kind of like, I don't know what, like a seer or whatever would go through the guts and try and predict the outcome of the battle based on whatever metrics he's using to look at smelly guts. But apparently they wanted to use real guts for this, and it felt like a bit of a gauntlet throw because Oliver Stone directed it, I think. And I think he was saying they wanted to use real guts because he wasn't convinced that silicon ones would look real. And we were like, oh, I think we can do that. So it was a bit of a challenge. So it was a case of, well, let's get some real ones in. And something like intestines, we didn't want to mold those because they're a nightmare and very long. So I sculpted like a loop of intestine about 3 feet long, and then made silicon versions of that. And yeah, that worked quite well. But it's amazing, like holding a real heart. I mean, it's huge. A cow heart is massive, and it's half of it's like solid. It's got like not cartilage, but some kind of firm, like white. It's bizarre seeing these things are real. What I'd never seen a pair of lungs before, that kind of thing. Grim,
uh,
nasty,
so
smells.
we've gone about 15 minutes over, so I'm keen to kind of, try
Keep
to
it
bring it
tight.
to a close because we're not going to get through nearly all these questions. Anyways, I did
Okay.
email you those, so if you do have time to go through some of them, where would you post the responses?
I can do them as an audio thing and post them on the blog, on the post. I
Okay,
can.
and that's at the Learn Makeup Effects site again.
That's our old blog. I'll tell you what I'm going to do. If you could bear it for a second, I'm just going to put the link to the podcast because that's the new. Um, sorry, it's just a link. Heaven, there we go. It's, the internet's so slow. Could be it's because the entire universe is working from home, isn't it? That's the podcast there, and you'll find us on Spotify or iTunes, wherever you find podcasts. And I will do post answers to those questions if you're happy for me to associate it with this. I will do that.
Yeah, absolutely. This is, this video is yours to keep, and whatever, any of your all uses.
Excellent.
I thought I'd just end with a just kind of one kind of question to close it in a more general way. And I thought, there's while there's a lot of people out there doing, the kind of work you do, I think you've made part of who you are, someone who kind of shares and teaches between your podcasts and teaching and Ivor Academy and and these other activities, and maybe like talk about a little bit about just that, like why you do that and what it's done for you, and or is it kind of a pay it forward thing, or I just think that's really, first of all, it's great, and thank you so much for doing this. And we just love people who like talking about the work and do it so well like you. But also, it's just, I'd be interested to hear, like, you know why have
Where
you
does that
chosen to
come
be
from?
someone who shared, and yeah, tell us a little bit about that.
Because I think two main reasons. One is I always, when I explain something, I try and do it as if I'm explaining to a 15-year-old version of myself who needs things explained in a certain way to understand it. And I quite often will use analogies to explain things because I think it makes associations between things, so it makes something easier to comprehend. So for me, it's partly for my own benefit because I want to be able to explain things in a way, because when I meet with things I don't understand, I want someone to explain it to me the way I need to hear it. Do you know what I mean? And I do that a lot. I mean, the amount of times I've come across an editing issue or a ZBrush issue and I'll look it up, and sometimes I don't even know how to ask the question because I don't know how to word what's happened. I've clicked on something and something's gone. I don't even know what that panel was called or whatever, and I'll go find it on YouTube, and then eventually I'll find a website or a video, and someone will be like, they'll answer your question and they'll do it succinctly, and they won't have like a 20-30 second intro that's brilliant and then this really tinny horrible noise which is jarring against, and then they'll talk about the other 50 posts they've done before they get to the actual answer of the question. You have to skip forward 3 minutes to get to it. And so when someone answers correctly and they clearly know what they're talking about and they understand that you're in a state of panic and they get to it, you kind of go, thank you. And I often find there are certain people about certain things I will have say I've subscribed to on YouTube because they've answered my question. So I personally understand the value of being able to solve someone's problem. And if they know what your problem is, not only more than you do, but also other people have done this and I had it too, and here's how I've dealt with it, it kind of steps you down and you're like, oh, and you're in that happy place again. So I want to do that for other people that want to know something that I know. I don't know a lot of stuff, but what I do know, if it's useful to somebody else, there's nothing better than getting them to be able to understand it. And also, I had a dad who was very, very methodical and very, he was an electrician by trade. So he was very like black, white, on, off, yes, no. He was very analytical and could work backwards to solve a problem, but he wasn't very good at communicating what he knew. And so to me, I'm very much excited about the ability to be able to convey something that I understand very well to somebody else if they want to hear about it. Um, because again, I've been the beneficiary of that myself. And also just very important meetings when I was trying to learn this stuff. There wasn't really anywhere to go to ask questions. There wasn't any internet. And I remember writing a letter to Dick Smith. A lot of people that do this stuff have these experiences where they wrote a letter to Dick Smith and he wrote back. He sent me, like, he was in New York and he sent me a letter back answering my questions and gave me a list of people I could ask further things to. He went to the trouble to do that. And that really touched me because I was like, he actually cares enough to respond. And he did like The Exorcist and stuff. You know, he was retired. He didn't need to do that. And it kind of made me think how much it affected me and how much it's motivated me. And it always amazes me how little somebody needs a little help to make them get past something. And it's like, if I can do that without it being a massive issue, and this is what's nice about the podcast is we get questions in or somebody I really want to speak to, and I've got some questions I want to ask. Like one of the big ones was number 40. I got to speak to Rick Baker. He agreed to chat to us on the podcast, and that was like, wow. So went to his house and we had a good chat, and it was really interesting. And the question I had for him was asking him about like, I have a contention about why practical people have an issue with digital. And I think it's because, as a practical person, you can sculpt and mold everything and make the piece and stick it on. And that's going to limit you from wanting to work in a team where now that same job is now done by 50 people. So you're not going to want to be part of that because I can say, I did it all myself. How do you feel about that? And he was really good at explaining, that's not how makeup work. And it was just, I get to ask questions to somebody else that I think is important. And if I can share that answer with other people, then other people will go, but you're thinking about it the wrong way. So you get taken out of your own head as well. So it kind of expands the conversation. And then maybe 20, 30 years from now, somebody that's hearing this will take a weird angle on this that I didn't even think of and go somewhere else with it. So you never know where this stuff is going to go. So it just feels like a weird kind of positive-y thing that feels like the right thing to do, whilst at the same time nourishes and sustains me whilst doing it. So it doesn't erode me. It's a good thing. So because I learn about it and I come across things, and sometimes you get things wrong, people call you on it, and you learn that way. So it's like,
Yeah.
it just feels like the right thing to do. And it's, hard work, but it's enjoyable.
A beautiful answer. So yeah, I just want to, thank you again for doing this. It's been great. I really enjoyed it. I was, I've done a lot of these, and I always say like, I like doing them just for me. So it's like,
Yeah,
if I, be like, it's great that other people showed up, but yeah, I just want to thank you. I'm sure, like, imagine the sound of 100 people applauding right now. I'm sure
you
they're
should have a
all
little
applauding for
applause
you.
app on your phone.
There's a little like someone in the chat right there. But thank you so much, and
No worries. Thank
really
you.
interesting, great presentation, excellent answers, and yeah. So the blog is the name of the same as the title of this talk, which is Battles with Bits of Rubber.
Yes,
So
sir.
that's probably the best place for people to go, right? For to find you and to find your talk. So yeah,
Amazing.
that's in the chat as well. But Battles with Bits of Rubber is easiest way. Stuart Bray. So thank you so much. Thank you
Thank
everybody
you,
for
Andrew. It's great.
coming. This was great fun. And yeah, take care everybody.
Amazing. Thank you so
Bye.
much. Cheers. Take care. Bye-bye.